I'm Captain Mary Price, 32 years old, a U.S. Air Force rescue pilot who's flown through sandstorms and gunfire to pull soldiers out alive. For years, I gave everything to hold my family together: the paychecks, the patience, the midnight feedings after 12-hour shifts. But when my ex-husband stood up in court and called me too broken for custody, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who used your strength against you? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I explain what happened that day, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about courage, boundaries, and quiet justice. What happened next might surprise you. I stood at attention in my dress blues the day I testified, back straight, hands steady on the witness stand. The courtroom smelled like old wood and furniture polish. My ex-husband Ethan sat across the aisle with his lawyer, both of them wearing expressions that said they'd already won. I'd flown rescue missions in sandstorms over Helmand Province, pulled wounded soldiers from burning wreckage at 13,000 feet, but nothing prepared me for watching the father of my child try to take her away by calling me broken. We met 7 years ago at a contractor briefing near Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson. I was 25, newly promoted to captain, and he was a civilian structural engineer reviewing hangar renovations. Ethan had kind eyes back then, the sort that crinkled when he smiled. He asked intelligent questions during the presentation about load-bearing requirements for aircraft maintenance facilities. Afterward, he approached me in the parking lot, not with a pickup line, but with a genuine question about how rescue helicopters handled desert thermals. I appreciated that he saw the pilot first, the woman second. Our courtship was careful and deliberate. I was between deployments, training new search and rescue crews at the 563rd Rescue Group. Ethan would drive out to the base perimeter, and we'd meet for coffee at a diner that served breakfast all day. He never complained when I had to cancel because of emergency drills or when my pager went off during dinners. He said he admired my dedication, that it was refreshing to meet someone who believed in something larger than themselves. 6 months later, he proposed in that same parking lot where we first spoke, holding a simple ring and telling me he wanted to build a life around my calling, not despite it. We married in a small ceremony at the base chapel. Colonel Dana Reeves, my commanding officer, attended in her service dress. I wore my uniform. Ethan wore a charcoal suit and looked genuinely happy. The reception was half military personnel, half his civilian engineering colleagues. I remember thinking how seamlessly our worlds seemed to blend that day, how natural it felt to introduce my squadron mates to his college friends. Everyone drank champagne and told stories, and when we cut the cake, someone played "Fly Me to the Moon" on the sound system. Ethan pulled me close and whispered that he was the luckiest man alive. My second deployment came 8 months into our marriage. For months in Afghanistan, flying combat search and rescue missions out of Bagram Airfield. I was designated Falcon 3, pilot in command of an HH-60 Pave Hawk. The work was intense and unrelenting. We flew at 0400 hours through mountain passes to extract wounded soldiers under fire. We pulled down pilots from Taliban-controlled valleys. Every mission carried the weight of someone's life, depending on our training and precision. I video called Ethan when I could, usually brief conversations where the connection cut in and out. He always said he understood, that he was proud of me, that he couldn't wait for me to come home. When I returned stateside, something had shifted. Ethan was quieter, more withdrawn. He'd rearranged the apartment while I was gone, moved my things into smaller spaces. My flight suits hung in the back of the closet instead of the front. My books were boxed in the garage. When I asked about it, he said he was just making the place more functional, that he'd gotten used to the space being his. I told myself it was normal adjustment, that couples needed time to recalibrate after separation. I focused on being present, on rebuilding our rhythm. Maya was born 2 years later, 6 pounds and 7 ounces, with my dark hair and Ethan's light eyes. I took maternity leave and fell completely in love with this tiny person who depended on me for everything. Ethan seemed thrilled at first. He took photos, sent announcements, built a crib from scratch in our spare room. But as the weeks passed and I returned to flying, the tension returned too. He started commenting on my schedule, how the Air Force expected too much, how I was choosing missions over our daughter. I explained that my career provided our stability, our health insurance, our housing allowance. He said those were just excuses. I transitioned to a training role to be home more consistently. I flew fewer combat missions and spent more time in classrooms, teaching younger pilots emergency procedures and survival tactics. It meant regular hours, predictable schedules, weekends at home. I thought it would help. Ethan said it wasn't enough, that real mothers didn't wear flight suits, that Maya needed someone who understood what normal family life looked like. I started doing more of the household work, more of the parenting, trying to prove I could balance both worlds. I handled midnight feedings before morning briefings. I planned birthday parties between flight evaluations. I made it work because I had to. The injury happened during a training exercise in Nevada. A mechanical failure during a simulated rescue caused a hard landing. I fractured my left wrist and sustained a concussion. The doctors grounded me for 6 weeks. I spent that time in physical therapy and medical evaluations, working to get cleared for flight status again. Ethan was distant throughout my recovery. He said I was obsessed with getting back in the cockpit, that I cared more about flying than healing, that Maya barely recognized me anymore because I was always at medical appointments. His words cut deeper than the injury. When I was finally cleared to return to duty, Ethan told me he wanted a separation. He said he'd been thinking about it for months, that he couldn't keep living with someone who prioritized the military over family. I asked if we could try counseling. He said he was done trying. I moved into temporary base housing while we figured out custody arrangements. Maya was 3 years old. I flew during the day and read her bedtime stories over video calls at night. She'd press her little hand against the screen and say, "Night-night, Mama." Those moments kept me functional. The custody filing came 2 months later. Ethan wanted full physical custody with supervised visitation for me. His petition cited my deployment history, my injury, my unpredictable schedule. It painted a picture of an absent mother married to her career, someone too damaged by combat to provide stable parenting. I read the documents in my quarters at 0200 hours, unable to sleep, unable to process how 7 years of trying to hold everything together had been reduced to a legal argument that I was unfit. I didn't cry. I'd learned in Afghanistan that tears didn't solve problems, that the only way forward was through the mission, step by step, procedure by procedure. So I found a lawyer and prepared to fight. The depositions began in March. I sat across from Ethan's attorney in a conference room with fluorescent lighting and cheap coffee. She was efficient and cold, asking questions designed to make me look unstable. How many deployments had I completed? 4. How many times had I been in active combat? Dozens. Had I ever been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress? Yes, after my 3rd deployment. Was I currently in treatment? Yes, through the Air Force medical system. Did I believe I was mentally fit to parent a young child? Absolutely yes. She produced my medical records, pages of therapy notes, and psychiatric evaluations from my time at Bagram. I'd sought help voluntarily after watching a crew member die during a mission. We'd been extracting wounded soldiers from a firefight when ground fire hit our helicopter. My co-pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, took shrapnel to the chest. I kept the bird steady while our flight medic tried to save him, but he died before we reached base. I was 27 years old, and I'd held his hand while he stopped breathing. The Air Force mandated counseling. I went willingly because I understood that processing trauma was part of staying mission capable. Ethan's lawyer held up those records like evidence of incompetence. She asked if I experienced nightmares. Sometimes. Hypervigilance? In certain situations. Difficulty with emotional regulation? I'd learned techniques to manage stress. She asked if Maya had ever witnessed me having a panic response. Never. I'd worked hard to ensure my daughter never saw me struggle, that she only knew the mother who read her stories and made her breakfast and took her to the park on weekends when I wasn't flying. But the attorney twisted every answer, suggesting that my coping mechanisms were proof of instability rather than strength. My own lawyer, a former JAG officer named Patricia Raines, told me the strategy was predictable. Ethan's side would try to portray military service as inherently damaging, especially for women, especially for mothers. They'd argue that combat exposure made me unpredictable, that PTSD made me dangerous. Patricia had seen it before in custody cases involving veterans. She said we'd counter with my service record, my performance evaluations, testimony from my commanding officers. She said we'd show that seeking treatment was responsible, not weak. But sitting in that conference room, listening to my trauma weaponized against me, I felt the weight of every mission, every loss, every sacrifice being reframed as failure. Ethan barely looked at me during his deposition. He'd gained weight, cut his hair shorter, dressed in button-down shirts that made him look like he'd stepped from a family catalog. His lawyer prompted him to describe our marriage, and he painted himself as the stable one, the present parent, the person who provided emotional consistency while I chased helicopters. He said I was always preparing for the next deployment, always distant, always treating home like a temporary duty station. He said Maya cried when I left for training exercises, that she'd started acting out at preschool, that she needed routine and stability that I couldn't provide. I wanted to interrupt, to remind him about the mortgage I paid with my salary, the health insurance that covered his chronic back problems, the college fund I'd started for Maya with my hazard pay. I wanted to mention the nights I'd walked the floor with our colicky infant while he slept through her crying, or the birthdays I'd organized despite being exhausted from back-to-back training missions. But Patricia squeezed my arm gently under the table, a reminder to stay quiet, to let him talk, to save my testimony for court. When Ethan's lawyer asked him directly if he believed I was fit to parent Maya, he paused for effect. Then he said, I think she's trying her best, but the military has changed her. She's not the person I married. Combat does things to people, and I don't think she's addressed those things adequately. Maya deserves a parent who isn't carrying that weight. I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded on the table, but inside I was cataloging every moment he dismissed my service. The times he'd called my uniform costume, the way he'd rolled his eyes when I explained deployment schedules, the comments about how real jobs didn't require leaving your family for months. He'd supported my career when it was abstract, when it was something he could brag about to his friends. But when it demanded sacrifice from him, when it required him to be the flexible one, the supportive one, he'd reframed my dedication as pathology. After the depositions, I met with my friend Tara Gwynn, a fellow captain who flew C-130 transports. We sat in her kitchen drinking tea while her husband watched their kids in the backyard. Tara had gone through her own custody battle 2 years earlier when her ex tried similar tactics. She'd won, but it cost her emotionally and financially. She told me to prepare for worse, that Ethan's side would dig for anything they could use, that they'd try to make my service look like a liability instead of an asset. They'll bring up every hard landing, every mission that went wrong, every time you came home exhausted, Tara said. They'll make it sound like you're a danger to your own kid. But you know what you are? You're someone who's saved lives. You're someone who's done what 99% of people couldn't do. Don't let them make you forget that. I thanked her and drove home to my small base apartment. Maya was with Ethan that night. The place felt empty without her toys scattered across the floor, without her voice asking for one more story before bed. I pulled out my service record and read through my performance evaluations, my commendations, my mission reports. Colonel Reeves had written that I was one of the most capable officers she'd commanded, that my composure under pressure saved lives, that I embodied the Air Force core values of integrity, service, and excellence. A 3-star general had signed off on my meritorious service medal for actions during a particularly difficult rescue mission in Afghanistan. These weren't the words describing someone broken. These were the words describing someone who'd chosen to serve despite the cost. But I also read through my therapy notes, the sessions where I'd talked about survivor's guilt, about the faces of soldiers I couldn't save, about the weight of command decisions. I'd been honest with my therapist about the nightmares, about the times I'd wake up thinking I was still in the cockpit, about the hyper-awareness that made me skin exits in public spaces. I'd been honest because healing required honesty. Now that honesty was being used to suggest I was too damaged to parent my own child. The military had taught me to face threats head-on, but I'd never imagined the threat would come from someone who'd promised to love me. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal. I arrived 15 minutes early in my service dress uniform, ribbons aligned, shoes polished. Patricia had advised against wearing military attire, suggesting it might appear calculated, but I disagreed. This uniform represented who I was, what I dedicated my adult life to achieving. I wasn't going to hide it because Ethan found it inconvenient. Ethan sat with his lawyer at the plaintiff's table. He wore a navy suit and kept his eyes forward. His parents sat in the gallery behind him, both retired teachers who'd never understood why their son married someone in the military. They'd always been polite to my face, but I'd overheard enough comments about dangerous jobs and unnatural choices for mothers to know what they really thought. My parents had wanted to attend, but I asked them to stay in Oregon. I needed to do this alone, to prove I could stand without reinforcement. Judge Samuel Harlan entered at 900 hours exactly. He was in his late 40s, gray at the temples, with the bearing of someone who'd seen difficult cases before. The bailiff called us to order and Judge Harlan settled into his chair, reviewing the case file. He looked tired, like he'd already handled 3 custody disputes that week. I understood the feeling of repetitive exhaustion, of processing the same types of problems with different faces. Ethan's lawyer presented first. She laid out a timeline of my military service, emphasizing deployments, combat missions, injuries. She submitted my medical records, highlighting the PTSD diagnosis and ongoing therapy. She called it documented psychological instability resulting from repeated trauma exposure. She presented testimony from Ethan's colleagues who'd heard him express concerns about my parenting capacity. She showed photos of Maya looking upset, though she provided no context for when or why those photos were taken. She built a narrative of a mother too consumed by military obligations to provide stable care, too damaged by combat to maintain emotional equilibrium. Then she called Ethan to testify. He took the stand and swore to tell the truth. His lawyer guided him through prepared answers about my absences, my injuries, my therapy appointments. He described moments when I'd been short-tempered after long shifts, when I'd seemed distant after difficult missions. He made it sound like I was perpetually on edge, always half-present, always distracted by Air Force responsibilities. He talked about finding Maya crying in her room after I'd left for a 2-week training exercise, how she'd asked why Mommy loved airplanes more than her. And when you expressed these concerns to Captain Price, his lawyer prompted, how did she respond? She said I didn't understand the importance of her work, Ethan answered. That I was being unsupportive. She made it clear that her career came first, that everything else had to accommodate her schedule, including our daughter. I watched him lie under oath and kept my face neutral. Patricia had warned me this would happen, that he'd twist conversations and reframe conflicts to support his narrative. She'd told me not to react, not to show anger or hurt, because any emotional response would be used as evidence of instability. So I sat perfectly still, shoulders back, hands folded, and let him finish. When it was Patricia's turn, she submitted my service record, my commendations, letters of recommendation from commanding officers. She called Colonel Reeves as a witness. Dana took the stand in her service dress and testified that I was one of the finest officers she'd commanded, that my decision-making under pressure was exceptional, that my dedication to my crew's welfare was absolute. She explained that seeking mental health treatment after traumatic events was not only normal, but required and encouraged in the military. She said that managing stress through professional help demonstrated maturity and responsibility, not weakness. Would you trust Captain Price with the lives of your personnel? Patricia asked. Without hesitation, Colonel Reeves replied. I have trusted her with the lives of my personnel. Repeatedly. She's never failed that trust. Patricia called Tara next. She testified about seeing me parent Maya, about watching me balance duty and family, about the care I took to ensure my daughter felt loved despite my demanding schedule. She talked about the birthday party I'd organized between flight evaluations, about the times I'd video called Maya from temporary duty stations just to read her bedtime stories, about the exhaustion I'd powered through to be present for my child. Then Patricia called me. I stood and walked to the witness stand, raised my right hand, swore to tell the truth. The room felt suddenly smaller, more focused. I could feel Ethan's parents watching from the gallery, could sense the judge's evaluation, could hear my own heartbeat in the silence. Patricia asked me to describe my service. I explained my role as a search and rescue pilot, the training required, the missions flown. I talked about the responsibility of command, about making life or death decisions in seconds, about the crew members who depended on my judgment. I explained that I'd sought therapy not because I was broken, but because I took my mental health seriously, because being a good pilot and a good mother required addressing trauma rather than ignoring it. Do you love your daughter? Patricia asked. More than anything, I said. Maya is the reason I fight to stay healthy, to process my experiences, to be the best version of myself. Every decision I make considers her well-being first. Then Ethan's lawyer cross-examined me. She asked about nightmares, about triggers, about moments when I'd struggled. I answered honestly because lying would only damage my credibility. Yes, I sometimes had nightmares about missions that went wrong. Yes, sudden loud noises sometimes made me tense. Yes, there were days when I felt exhausted from the weight of responsibility. But I also explained my coping strategies, my support system, my commitment to ongoing treatment. I explained that trauma didn't make me dangerous. It made me human. But Captain Price, she pressed, can you honestly say that your military service hasn't affected your ability to parent? That watching people die hasn't changed how you relate to your child. I met her eyes. My service has absolutely affected how I parent. It's taught me the value of every moment. It's shown me how fragile life is, how quickly things can change. So yes, I hold my daughter a little tighter. I tell her I love her more often. I make sure she knows she's my priority. If that's the effect of my service, then I'm grateful for it. The lawyer looked frustrated but continued. And yet you continue to serve, to put yourself in situations where you could be injured or killed, leaving your daughter without a mother. I serve in a training capacity now, I said. My risk profile is significantly lower. But even when I was flying combat missions, I did everything possible to come home safe. Because Maya deserves a mother who shows her that women can be strong, capable, and dedicated to something larger than themselves. I want my daughter to grow up knowing that service matters, that protecting others matters, that sacrifice has meaning. The lawyer paused, then played her final card. Your Honor, we believe Captain Price's documented psychological instability and continued military service create an unsuitable environment for a young child. We're asking for full custody with supervised visitation until such time as Captain Price can demonstrate sustained mental health and career stability. Then Ethan spoke directly, his voice carrying across the courtroom. Your Honor, she's too broken to raise a child. I'm just trying to protect our daughter from someone who can't guarantee emotional stability. The word broken hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. I kept my posture straight, my expression controlled, but something cracked inside my chest. This man had shared my bed, had held our daughter at birth, had promised to support my career. And now he was publicly declaring me too damaged to parent, using my service and my trauma as weapons against me. Judge Harlan looked up from the case file, his expression unreadable. He flipped through pages slowly, reading medical records, service evaluations, testimony transcripts. The courtroom was silent except for the rustle of paper. I watched him process information, make calculations, prepare to render judgment on whether I was fit to raise my own child. My hands stayed folded in my lap, steady despite everything. Judge Harlan continued reading, his expression shifting from neutral attention to something else, something I couldn't immediately identify. He turned a page in my service record and froze. His eyes moved across the text once, then again, slower. His jaw tightened. He looked up at me, then back down at the file, confirming something. The color drained from his face. Captain Price, he said quietly, his voice different now, uncertain. Call sign Falcon 3? I straightened slightly. Yes, Your Honor. He set the file down carefully, like it might shatter. His hands were shaking. September 20th, 2016. Operation Resolute Guardian. Extraction from Grid Coordinate November 743. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what he was referencing. A rescue mission in Kunar Province, Afghanistan. A squad pinned down by Taliban fighters in a valley with no ground support available. We'd flown in under fire, rotor blades clipping tree branches, taking rounds through the fuselage. We'd pulled out 13 soldiers, 3 of them critical. One of the wounded had been a young lieutenant, barely 24, with a sucking chest wound and compound fractures. I'd helped the flight medic stabilize him during the 40-minute flight to Bagram while our co-pilot handled controls and our crew chief returned suppressive fire through the open door. Judge Harlan stood slowly, like his legs weren't quite steady. He looked at me with an expression I'd seen before on the faces of people I'd pulled from bad situations, a mixture of disbelief and recognition and something raw. I was that lieutenant, he said, his voice breaking slightly. You held pressure on my chest wound. You told me to stay with you, that we'd get through it together. You said, I don't lose my people, Lieutenant. You're going home. The courtroom went completely silent. I remembered his face now, younger then, gray with blood loss, terrified. He'd kept trying to tell me something about his unit, about men still trapped. I'd told him his squad was aboard, everyone accounted for, that his job was just to breathe. He'd passed out somewhere over Jalalabad and I'd thought we might lose him. But the surgeons at Bagram had worked miracles and he'd survived. I spent 6 months in recovery, Judge Harlan continued, addressing the courtroom now, his voice stronger. I was told the wounds should have killed me, that the only reason I made it was because the pilot held that bird steady under fire while her medic kept me alive, and because she refused to give up on any of us. They gave her a medal for that mission. Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor. I wrote a letter thanking her, but I never knew if she received it. He turned to Ethan, his expression hardening. This is the woman you're calling too broken to parent? This is the person you're claiming lacks stability and judgment? Captain Price saved my life and the lives of 12 other men. She flew into a combat zone that ground commanders had declared too dangerous for rescue attempts. She brought us home when no one else would try. Ethan's face had gone pale. His lawyer looked blindsided, shuffling papers like she might find some response in her files. The courtroom gallery was completely still. Judge Harlan picked up the custody petition and read through Ethan's allegations again, his jaw working. Then he looked at the medical records, at the PTSD diagnosis, at the therapy notes. When he spoke, his voice carried weight. This court recognizes that Captain Price has undergone treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from multiple combat deployments. The court also recognizes that seeking and engaging in mental health treatment is a sign of responsibility and self-awareness, not instability. The court finds that Captain Price's military service, far from being a liability, demonstrates exceptional judgment, courage, and dedication. Her service record shows consistent excellence in high-pressure environments where lives depend on her decisions. He set the papers down and looked directly at Ethan. The court further finds that the petitioner's characterization of Captain Price as too broken to parent is not only unsupported by evidence, but represents a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma, treatment, and resilience. This petition appears motivated not by genuine concern for the child's welfare, but by the petitioner's discomfort with his ex-wife's career and his desire to punish her for choices he disagreed with. Ethan started to speak, but his lawyer put a hand on his arm. The court finds no credible evidence that Captain Price poses any risk to her daughter, Judge Harlan continued. The evidence instead shows a mother who has consistently prioritized her child's welfare, who maintains stable employment and housing, who seeks appropriate mental health care, and who has demonstrated extraordinary character in both her professional and personal life. The petition for full custody is denied. He paused, then added, and Mr. Calloway, you should be deeply ashamed of yourself. This woman saved my life. She's saved countless lives. She's done what most people couldn't imagine doing, and she's sought help to process those experiences like a responsible adult. The fact that you've tried to weaponize her service and her trauma against her in a custody dispute is contemptible. This court will not reward that behavior. The gavel came down hard. Case dismissed. Joint custody remains as previously established. This hearing is concluded. Judge Harlan stood and walked out quickly, his shoulders tight. I could see him struggling with composure, with the sudden collision of his past and present. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the table. His lawyer was already packing her briefcase, her expression professional but tight. His parents looked stunned. Patricia touched my shoulder gently. "You're free to go, Mary. It's over." I gathered my things slowly, methodically, the way I'd been trained to secure equipment after a mission. My hands were steady now, though I could feel adrenaline starting to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. I'd prepared for a long fight, for appeals and delays and ongoing battles. I hadn't prepared for this, for the strange mercy of random intersection, for the possibility that someone whose life I'd saved might one day return that favor in ways I couldn't anticipate. Tara was waiting in the hallway outside. She hugged me hard, then stepped back and looked at me with concern. "You okay?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think so." Colonel Reeves approached, still in her service dress. "That was extraordinary, Mary. You handled yourself perfectly." "I didn't do anything," I said. The judge remembered a mission from years ago. "That's luck, not planning." "No," Reeves said firmly. "That's what happens when you do the right thing consistently. You never know when your actions will matter, when the people you help will show up again. But they do show up, Mary. They remember. And today, one of them had the chance to speak for you when you needed it most." I thanked her and walked outside. The courthouse steps were warm in the afternoon sun. I called Maya from my cell phone. Ethan's mother answered, sounding subdued. She put Maya on the line. "Hi, Mama," my daughter said, her voice bright and uncomplicated. "Are you coming to get me soon?" "Yes, baby," I said, my voice steady. "I'm coming right now. We're going to go get ice cream and then go home. Just you and me. Can we get chocolate? We can get whatever flavor you want." I hung up and stood there for a moment, looking at the sky, clear and blue and vast. I thought about that mission in Afghanistan, about how routine it had seemed at the time despite the danger. Just another extraction, another group of soldiers who needed help, another day of doing the job I'd trained for. I'd never expected it to matter beyond that moment, beyond getting those men to safety and filing the mission report. But Judge Harlan had carried that memory for 8 years, had built a life around the second chance my crew had given him. And today, that memory had spoken when I had no words left. I drove to pick up Maya, my daughter who thought her mother was strong because she flew helicopters, who didn't yet understand the weight those flights sometimes carried. Maybe someday I'd tell her about this day, about how service creates threads that connect across years and distance, about how the hardest work we do sometimes pays dividends in ways we can't predict. Or maybe I'd just keep flying, keep serving, keep showing her through action that strength meant doing hard things even when they hurt, even when people called you broken for trying. I picked up Maya from Ethan's parents' house 20 minutes later. She ran down the driveway with her backpack bouncing, arms spread wide. I caught her and held on longer than usual, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. She pulled back and looked at my face with that uncanny perception children sometimes have. "You look tired, Mama," she said, touching my cheek. "Did you have a long day?" "Sort of," I said. "But it's better now. Ready for that ice cream." We went to the place on Baseline Road that served waffle cones and had outdoor seating. Maya ordered chocolate with rainbow sprinkles. I got vanilla and we sat at a picnic table under a mesquite tree. She talked about preschool, about a girl named Emma who'd shared her crayons, about how they were learning to count to 20 in Spanish. I listened and nodded and let her voice wash over me like something clean and uncomplicated. My phone buzzed twice. Messages from Patricia confirming paperwork and from Colonel Reeves checking in. I silenced the phone and focused on my daughter. There'd be time later to process what happened, to think through implications and next steps. Right now, I just wanted to be present, to watch Maya eat ice cream and laugh about silly things, to remember why every hard decision had been worth it. When we got home to my apartment on base, Maya wanted to color. We spread out on the living room floor with construction paper and markers. She drew a picture of an airplane with a stick figure in the window, labeled Mama in wobbly letters. I drew one of her with flowers. She added a sun to my picture and declared it needed more color, so we worked together making it brighter until the whole page was covered in yellows and oranges and reds. At bedtime, I read her 3 books instead of the usual 2. She fell asleep holding her stuffed rabbit, breathing soft and even. I stayed in her room for a while, watching her sleep, thinking about all the nights I'd missed while deployed, all the video calls that had been poor substitutes for actually tucking her in. I'd made sacrifices to serve, and some of those sacrifices had cost me time I'd never get back. But I'd also shown her a version of womanhood that wasn't confined to traditional expectations, a mother who was both nurturing and strong, both present and dedicated to something larger. Later that night, I sat on my small balcony with a mug of tea. The base was quiet, just the distant sound of engines from the flight line. My phone buzzed again, a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Captain Price, a man's voice said, tentative. This is Judge Harlan. I hope it's okay that I called. Patricia Raines gave me your number. Yes, sir, I said, surprised. It's fine. He was quiet for a moment. I wanted to apologize for how things went today. I should have recused myself when I saw your name on the case. It wasn't appropriate for me to preside over a hearing involving someone I had personal history with, even positive history. You dismissed the case fairly, Your Honor. The evidence didn't support his claims. Maybe so, but my reaction was personal, and that shouldn't happen in a courtroom. I'm going to file a disclosure with the Judicial Review Board. Let them decide if there should be any follow-up. I appreciated his integrity, even if it complicated things. I understand. For what it's worth, I don't think your decision was wrong. Just unexpected. I've thought about that mission 1,000 times, he said quietly. I've wondered what happened to you, to your crew. I wrote that letter, but never knew if it reached you. And then today, seeing you in my courtroom, hearing your ex-husband call you broken after what you did for me and my men, I just couldn't let that stand unchallenged. Those words were obscene. Thank you for saying so. It meant more than you know. I hope your daughter understands someday how lucky she is to have a mother like you. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, just 2 people processing an unlikely intersection. When we hung up, I sat for a while longer in the dark, thinking about missions and consequences and the strange arithmetic of service. I'd flown that rescue because it was my job, because soldiers needed help, because training and duty and moral obligation had all aligned. I'd never imagined it would matter beyond that day. But Judge Harlan had remembered, and his memory had changed everything. The next morning, I got a call from Major Blake Turner, my commanding officer in the reserve unit I'd be transitioning to. I'd put in transfer paperwork months ago, wanting to stay near Maya while still maintaining my commission. The reserve role would mean 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, with flexibility for additional duty. It was a compromise, but one that let me keep flying while being more present for my daughter. Heard about your court case, Major Turner said. Colonel Reeves filled me in. Hell of a situation. It worked out, sir. More than worked out, from what I understand. Anyway, your transfer is approved. You'll be assigned to the 934th Airlift Wing, C-130 training program. We need experienced pilots to work with newer crews. It's mostly simulator time and classroom instruction, some flight evaluations. Good hours, stable schedule. Sound acceptable? More than acceptable, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me, Captain. You earned this. We're glad to have you. I told Maya that evening that Mama would be working different hours soon, that I'd be home more consistently, that we could plan things without worrying about sudden deployment orders. She was thrilled, already making plans for weekend trips to the Science Museum and the zoo. I didn't tell her about the custody hearing, about how close we'd come to losing our routine. She didn't need that weight. She just needed to know her mother was reliable, present, and safe. A week later, I received a package at the base post office. Inside was a framed photograph, slightly faded, showing an HH-60 Pavehawk in flight against a mountain backdrop. A note was paper-clipped to the back in neat handwriting, taken the day before the mission. I found this in my deployment photos. Thought you might want it. With eternal gratitude, Sam Harlan. I hung the photo in my hallway where I'd see it every day. Maya asked what it was, and I told her it was from a mission a long time ago, from a day when everything went right despite the odds. She studied the helicopter with serious concentration, then announced she wanted to fly one someday. I told her she could do anything she set her mind to, that the sky wasn't a limit but an invitation. She smiled and went back to playing, and I stood there looking at that photograph, thinking about second chances and the long, unpredictable arc of consequences. Ethan didn't contact me directly after the hearing. His lawyer sent formal notification that he was withdrawing his custody petition entirely. Patricia explained that he likely realized any appeal would fail and might actually result in reduced custody for him given Judge Harlan's assessment. We'd return to the original agreement, joint custody, alternating weeks, shared decisions about education and healthcare. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair, and it meant Maya would have both parents in her life, even if those parents could no longer stand to be in the same room. I saw him once at Maya's preschool during a parent-teacher conference. We sat on opposite sides of the room and spoke only about our daughter's progress. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered. When the conference ended, he left quickly without making eye contact. I felt nothing watching him go, no anger or satisfaction or regret. Just a kind of tired relief that the fight was over, that we could both move forward into whatever came next. That night, I wrote a letter to Judge Harlan thanking him for his integrity and his service. I told him I did receive his original letter years ago, that it had meant a great deal during a difficult time. I told him I hoped he was well, that his family was thriving, that the second chance my crew had given him was being used for good things. I mailed it and didn't expect a response. Some conversations don't need continuation, just acknowledgement. The transition to reserve duty happened over the following months. I reported to the 934th Airlift Wing at Davis-Monthan and met my new crew, a mix of active duty and reserve personnel who flew C-130 Hercules transports. The work was different from combat rescue, less immediate adrenaline, but still meaningful. I trained young pilots on emergency procedures, evaluated their decision-making during simulated crises, and helped them develop the instincts that kept crews alive when everything went wrong. Major Turner ran a professional operation. He'd flown in Iraq during the surge and understood the complexity of transitioning from active combat roles to training positions. During my first briefing, he pulled me aside and asked directly if I was okay, if the reduced flight hours would be satisfying after years of high-intensity missions. Honestly, sir, I don't know yet, I said. But I need this schedule. My daughter needs this schedule. Understood. Just know that training matters, Captain. You'll be teaching these kids how to stay alive, how to bring their crews home. That's not less important than combat flying, it's just different timing. You're investing in future missions, not flying them yourself. He was right, though it took time to internalize. The first few months felt strange, like watching other people do the job I'd trained for. I'd sit in the simulator observation room while young pilots worked through scenarios I'd lived through for real, and I'd have to resist the urge to take the controls myself. But gradually I found satisfaction in watching them improve, in seeing lieutenants who'd freeze under pressure learn to process information calmly, in helping crew chiefs understand the pilot's perspective during emergencies. I also started volunteering with a veteran support organization that operated out of Tucson. They ran group therapy sessions, job placement programs, and family counseling for military personnel transitioning to civilian life. A retired Army psychiatrist named Dr. Elena Vasquez led the clinical programs. She'd served in Vietnam as a nurse and understood the specific challenges of combat trauma. My first group session was awkward. 6 of us sitting in a circle in a community center conference room, coffee and cookies on a side table, everyone looking uncomfortable. Dr. Vasquez opened by saying this wasn't therapy, just conversation among people who'd experienced similar things. We went around sharing basics, name, branch where we'd served. When my turn came, I kept it simple. Mary Price. Air Force Captain. Flew rescue missions in Afghanistan. Still serving in the reserve. A former Marine sergeant named Carlos spoke next, talking about struggling to find civilian work that felt meaningful. A Navy corpsman named Jennifer described panic attacks in grocery stores when too many people crowded around her. An Army specialist named David talked about anger issues that were destroying his marriage. Their stories resonated in ways that conversations with civilians never did. These people understood what it meant to come home carrying weight that couldn't be explained to anyone who hadn't been there. Over the following months, I became a regular at those sessions. I talked about the custody hearing, about how my trauma had been weaponized against me, about the ongoing work of processing loss and fear and moral injury. The group listened without judgment, offered perspective from their own experiences, reminded me that seeking help was strength rather than weakness. Dr. Vasquez occasionally pulled me aside to check in privately, making sure I was maintaining my individual therapy, ensuring the group wasn't becoming a substitute for more intensive treatment. Maya thrived during this period. The stable schedule meant I could volunteer at her preschool, attend field trips, be present for everyday moments I'd missed during active deployments. I watched her learn to write her name, to count by tens, to navigate friendships with other 4-year-olds. She talked constantly about becoming a pilot like Mama, though she also wanted to be a veterinarian and a princess and a dinosaur expert. I encouraged all of it, told her she could be anything, that the world was full of possibilities. Ethan and I developed a functional co-parenting relationship, though it never became warm. We exchanged Maya at neutral locations, communicated primarily through text about schedules and school events, attended her activities separately when possible. He'd started dating someone new, a teacher at his company's training center. Maya mentioned her occasionally, always careful like she was worried about hurting my feelings. I told her it was fine, that Daddy having a friend was good, that grown-ups could care about more than one person. I meant it mostly. I didn't want Ethan back, didn't miss what we'd had. But I sometimes felt the loss of what I'd thought we were building, the partnership I'd believed in. That grief had nothing to do with him specifically, and everything to do with the death of a particular future I'd imagined. Dr. Vasquez said that was normal, that we mourn the loss of possibilities even when the reality wasn't serving us. One Saturday afternoon, I took Maya to an air show at Davis Monthan. We watched fighter demonstrations and transport flyovers from the flight line. The Thunderbirds performed, their F-16s cutting through the desert sky in tight formation. Maya's face was pure wonder, her hand gripping mine, her voice shouting excitement every time the jets passed overhead. During a break in the program, we walked through the static displays where crews stood by their aircraft answering questions. We stopped at AC-130, the same model I now trained pilots to fly. The crew chief, a young woman with staff sergeant stripes, was explaining the cargo capacity to a group of civilians. Maya tugged my hand and pointed at the sergeant's uniform. "She has the same job as you, Mama," Maya said, her voice carrying that definitive certainty that 4-year-olds have about the world. "Similar," I said. "She takes care of the airplane, makes sure everything works right. I fly it." The sergeant overheard and smiled. "Your mom's a pilot?" Maya nodded vigorously. "She's Captain Price. She rescues people." "That's impressive," the sergeant said, looking at me with respect. "We need more women flying. It's getting better, but we're still working on it." After the air show, Maya and I got hamburgers at a diner near the base. She colored on the paper menu while we waited for food, drawing airplanes and stick figures. I watched her work, this small person who existed because Ethan and I had once believed we could build something lasting, and I felt grateful despite everything. Maya was the best thing to come from that failed marriage, the one uncomplicated good that justified all the complicated difficult. "Mama," she said without looking up from her drawing, "are you sad sometimes?" The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes, yeah." "Why?" "You look sad when you think I'm not watching. But then you smile when you see me looking." I put down my coffee. For years old and already reading subtext, already learning to observe emotional undercurrents. "I'm not sad right now, baby. Sometimes I think about things that are hard, but that doesn't mean I'm sad." Does that make sense? Like when I think about the time I fell off the swing? Kind of like that. Sometimes we remember hard things, but remembering doesn't mean we're stuck there. We're just making sure we learned from it. She accepted this and went back to drawing. I wondered what she'd remember from this period when she was older, what stories she'd tell about her childhood. I hoped she'd remember the good parts, the air shows and bedtime stories and ice cream trips. But I also knew she'd carry some understanding of difficulty, of adult conflicts that affected children even when those children were shielded from direct impact. I couldn't prevent that entirely. I could only try to show her that people survived hard things, that struggle didn't erase joy, that strength meant continuing forward even when the path was unclear. A year passed. Maya started kindergarten, suddenly looking impossibly grown up in her backpack and light-up sneakers. I drove her to school each morning before reporting for duty, and some afternoons I was able to pick her up myself instead of relying on after-school care. She made friends easily, brought home artwork covered in glitter and construction paper, learned to read simple words. Her teacher said she was bright and curious, that she asked questions constantly, that she loved sharing stories about her pilot mother during show and tell. My reserve work became more fulfilling as I developed curriculum for emergency procedures training. I wrote scenarios based on real missions I'd flown, sanitizing details, but keeping the core decision-making challenges intact. Young pilots would work through situations where everything degraded simultaneously: weather, mechanical failures, injured crew members, hostile environments, and they'd have to prioritize, adapt, and execute under pressure. Some of them thrived. Others discovered they weren't suited for high-stress flying and transferred to different specialties. Both outcomes were valuable. Better to learn limitations in a simulator than during an actual emergency. I was promoted to major in the spring, a ceremony held in a hangar at Davis-Monthan with Maya in attendance. Colonel Reeves came despite being stationed in Colorado now, and she pinned on my new rank insignia, while Maya watched with solemn attention. Afterward, Maya asked if being a major meant I was in charge of everyone. I explained it just meant I had more responsibility, more people depending on my decisions. She said that sounded hard and asked if I was scared. I told her sometimes, but scared and capable weren't opposites, that you could feel both simultaneously and still do good work. My veterans group continued meeting monthly. We developed a tight community, people who understood each other's struggles without extensive explanation. Carlos had found work as a mechanic and was rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. Jennifer had gone back to school for nursing, channeling her medical training into civilian healthcare. David was divorcing, but doing it with more awareness and less anger than seemed possible a year earlier. We celebrated successes and acknowledged setbacks and reminded each other that progress wasn't linear, that healing took time and effort and patience. Dr. Vasquez asked me to speak at a conference about veteran reintegration. I was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with public attention, but she pushed gently. Your story matters, Mary. Not the dramatic parts, the everyday parts. How you've maintained your career while addressing trauma. How you've parented through difficulty. How you've built a life that accommodates both your service identity and your civilian needs. Other veterans need to hear that it's possible. I spoke for 20 minutes to a room of clinicians, veterans advocates, and military personnel. I talked about the custody hearing honestly, about how trauma had been weaponized against me, about the importance of systems that supported rather than punished help-seeking behavior. I talked about the reserve transition, about finding meaning in training roles, about building community through veterans groups. I didn't position myself as exceptional or heroic, just as someone working through the standard challenges that most service members faced eventually. The response was overwhelming. People approached afterward with their own stories, their own struggles, their gratitude for honest conversation about imperfect recovery. Ethan remarried that summer. I heard about it through Maya, who mentioned attending Daddy's wedding with the casualness of someone describing a trip to the park. She said the bride wore a pretty dress and there was cake. She asked if I was sad that Daddy married someone else. I told her no, that I wanted Daddy to be happy, that adults sometimes found new people to love, and that was okay. She accepted this and moved on to more important topics like whether we could get a dog. I ran into Ethan once at Maya's school during a parent conference. His new wife was with him, younger than both of us, with kind eyes and a nervous smile. We exchanged polite greetings, discussed Maya's progress, and parted quickly. There was no hostility, just the bland civility of two people whose lives had briefly intersected and then diverged. His wife touched his arm as they walked away, a gesture of either comfort or possession. I felt nothing watching them go except mild relief that Maya had another stable adult in her life. My individual therapy continued, though less frequently. I'd moved from weekly sessions to monthly check-ins with Dr. Keller, who'd been my therapist since the custody hearing. We talked about managing hypervigilance, about distinguishing between legitimate threats and trauma-triggered anxiety, about building a life that acknowledged difficulty without being defined by it. She said I was doing the work, that my progress was visible, that I should be proud of how far I'd come. I accepted the praise uncomfortably, still more comfortable with action than evaluation. I received an award that fall for my training curriculum development. The Air Force Achievement Medal, not as significant as my previous commendations, but meaningful in its recognition of education work. Maya attended the ceremony and afterward asked if I was famous. I told her no, just good at my job. She said that was the same thing. Her logic was both innocent and profound. Reminder that significance wasn't about recognition, but about doing meaningful work well. Judge Harlan reached out around Thanksgiving. He'd been nominated for a federal judgeship and wanted me to know, said he'd listed me as a personal reference in his application materials. He asked if that was acceptable, if I was comfortable with our shared history being part of his professional record. I told him, of course, that I was honored, that he'd earned whatever advancement came his way. We talked briefly about our families. His daughter was in high school now, interested in medicine. He said she volunteered at a veterans hospital, that she'd been inspired by her father's stories about the people who'd saved his life. Winter came, cold by Arizona standards, though nothing like the mountain regions I'd flown in Afghanistan. Maya and I established rituals: Friday movie nights, Sunday morning pancakes, weekend hikes in the Catalina foothills. She grew taller, more articulate, increasingly independent. She'd started asking harder questions about my work, about where I'd been deployed, about whether I'd ever been scared. I answered honestly but age-appropriately, acknowledging difficulty without overwhelming her with details. She absorbed this information seriously, processing it with that intense concentration children apply to understanding their parents' lives. One evening, Maya brought home a school assignment: draw your hero. She'd drawn me in flight gear standing in front of a helicopter, labeled my mom Captain Price in careful letters. Her teacher had written a note saying Maya had explained to the class that heroes were people who helped others even when it was hard, that her mom did that by flying rescue missions. I hung the drawing on the refrigerator, this simple crayon rendering that captured something essential about how my daughter saw me. I realized that night that I'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopped anticipating the next crisis or betrayal or loss. The hypervigilance I developed through combat and custody battles had gradually softened into something more manageable. I still scanned exits in public spaces, still tensed at sudden loud noises, still had occasional nightmares about missions gone wrong. But these responses no longer controlled me. They were part of my landscape, manageable terrain rather than insurmountable obstacles. Dr. Vasquez said I'd reached a kind of equilibrium, a balance between acknowledging trauma and living fully despite it. She said that was the real work of recovery, not erasing difficulty, but integrating it into a functional life. I'd spent years afraid that my combat experiences had broken something essential, that I'd lost some capacity for normal existence. But standing in my kitchen looking at Maya's drawing, I understood that broken and functional weren't mutually exclusive. I carried scars, visible and invisible, and those scars informed who I'd become. They'd made me more cautious in some ways, more deliberate in others, more appreciative of stability and small moments of peace. Maya turned 7 the following spring. We threw a birthday party at a park near our apartment, inviting her classmates and a few military families I'd become close with. She wanted a space theme, so we decorated with planets and rockets, served cake shaped like the moon. Tara and Gwen attended with her family, along with Colonel Reeves, who'd driven down from Colorado specifically for the event. Maya opened presents with enthusiastic attention, thanking each guest with the careful politeness I'd worked to instill. Ethan came for the last hour with his wife and their new baby, a boy they'd named Christopher. It was the first time we'd been at the same event for an extended period since the custody hearing. We maintained careful distance, interacting only when Maya needed something from both of us. His wife held the baby and made polite conversation with other parents, clearly trying to ease any awkwardness. I appreciated the effort even if it didn't entirely work. Some histories couldn't be smoothed over with good intentions. Maya was fascinated by her half-brother, peering at him with the intense curiosity of an older sibling encountering a baby. She asked if she could hold him, and Ethan's wife obliged, supporting the baby carefully while Maya sat cross-legged and still. She looked up at me with wonder and said, "Mama, he's so tiny." Was I this small? Even smaller, I said. "You were 6 pounds, 7 ounces. He looks bigger." She studied Christopher with scientific attention, then declared he was perfect and carefully returned him to his mother. Later, after most guests had left and we were cleaning up decorations, Maya asked if having a baby brother changed anything. I asked what she meant. Like, do I have to share my time with Daddy now? With the baby? You might have to share some, I said carefully. But that doesn't mean Daddy loves you less. People's hearts get bigger, they don't get divided. You'll always be his first daughter, always be special to him. But I only have you, she said. You don't have another kid. The observation caught me unprepared. That's true. You're my only daughter. But that's not better or worse than Daddy's situation, it's just different. You're enough for me, Maya. You're everything. She processed this and seemed satisfied. We finished cleaning while she chattered about which presents she'd play with first, the space-themed crisis apparently resolved. But I thought about that conversation for days afterward, about how children processed family complexity, about the emotional mathematics of divided households and blended families. Maya would navigate this landscape her entire childhood, learning to exist in 2 households with different rules and different people. I couldn't prevent that complexity, could only try to make my space stable and loving enough to anchor her through the transitions. My work expanded that summer. Major Turner asked me to develop a mentorship program for junior officers, particularly women, entering flight roles. The Air Force had made progress on gender integration, but challenges remained, both structural and cultural. Young women pilots still encountered assumptions about capability, still faced questions about balancing career and family that their male counterparts rarely heard. I remembered my own early years, the quiet doubt I'd sometimes sensed, the need to prove myself capable before being treated as such. I met with a group of 8 female lieutenants and captains, ranging from pilots to navigators to flight engineers. We talked about practical challenges, how to handle gender-based skepticism, how to maintain authority when you looked younger than your crew, how to navigate career decisions around potential family planning. Some of their questions were technical, others deeply personal. One young pilot asked how I'd managed deployment when Maya was a toddler. I told her honestly, with difficulty, with support systems, with acceptance that perfect balance was impossible and adequate balance required constant adjustment. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked. "Having a child while serving?" "Never," I said. I regretted missing moments. I regretted being away during important milestones. But I never regretted Maya's existence or my decision to be both a mother and an officer. Those regrets are different things. The mentorship program became ongoing, meeting quarterly. The women shared their experiences, offered advice to each other, created a network of support that existed outside official command structures. Several of them later told me those conversations changed their career trajectory, gave them permission to pursue advancement without abandoning other life goals. I understood that impact viscerally, remembered my own need for examples of women who'd navigated these paths successfully. Judge Harlan was confirmed to the federal bench that fall. The news mentioned his military service, his distinguished career as a state judge, his reputation for fairness and integrity. He sent me a handwritten note thanking me for the reference letter I'd written, saying it had mattered during the confirmation process. He invited me to his investiture ceremony. I attended in my service dress, sitting in the back of a crowded courtroom while he took his oath. His family was there, including his daughter, who'd become a pre-med student. During the reception afterward, he introduced me to her. "This is Captain Price," he said quietly. "The pilot I told you about. The one who saved my life." His daughter shook my hand firmly. "My dad talks about that mission constantly. He says it changed everything for him, made him more aware of how fragile life is, how important it is to use second chances well." "He's done that," I said. "He should be very proud." I left soon after, uncomfortable with extended attention, but I felt satisfied driving home. Judge Harlan had taken his second chance and built something meaningful from it, had used his authority to help others, had raised a daughter who understood the value of service. That seemed like a reasonable outcome for a mission I'd flown 8 years ago, without knowing the ripple effects would reach this far. Maya struggled with third-grade math that winter. She'd always been strong in reading, but numbers frustrated her. I spent evenings at our kitchen table working through addition and subtraction, trying to find ways to make abstract concepts concrete. We used physical objects, drew pictures, created stories about numbers. Progress was incremental and sometimes frustrating for both of us. One night she threw her pencil down and said math was stupid, that she'd never use it anyway. "You want to be a pilot," I reminded her gently. "Pilots use math constantly. Navigation, fuel calculations, weight distribution, approach angles. All math." "Then I won't be a pilot," she said, tears forming. "I'll do something else." I recognized the frustration, the impulse to abandon difficulty rather than push through it. "Maya, learning hard things is how we get better at everything else. Math is hard for you right now, but that doesn't mean it'll always be hard. You just need practice and patience." We worked through it, slowly and with frequent breaks. By spring, her grades had improved and her confidence had returned. The experience taught me something about parenting that combat had never prepared me for: the patience required for long-term development, the faith that incremental progress would eventually accumulate into genuine skill. Flying was often binary, mission success or mission failure. Parenting operated on a different timeline, with outcomes that wouldn't be fully visible for years or decades. That spring, I was asked to testify before a congressional subcommittee reviewing veterans' mental health services. My involvement came through Dr. Vasquez's advocacy work. She'd submitted testimony about gaps in care and recommended me as a witness who could speak to both clinical treatment and lived experience. I was hesitant, uncomfortable with political attention, but Dr. Vasquez insisted my perspective mattered. I flew to Washington, D.C. and testified for 30 minutes about my experience with Air Force mental health services, about the importance of confidential treatment, about the dangers of stigmatizing help-seeking behavior. I talked about the custody hearing, about how my treatment records had been weaponized despite successful recovery. Several committee members asked pointed questions about privacy protections and whether military personnel feared career repercussions for seeking help. I answered honestly, many did fear those repercussions, often with good reason, and that fear prevented early intervention that could save lives and careers. The testimony generated more attention than I'd anticipated. Military publications ran articles about veterans' mental health advocacy. I received emails from service members thanking me for speaking publicly about treatment, for challenging stigma, for demonstrating that seeking help didn't mean abandoning military identity. Some messages were from people struggling with their own trauma, asking for advice or resources. I responded when I could, directing them toward appropriate services, reminding them that recovery was possible even when it felt impossible. The Air Force asked me to participate in a mental health awareness campaign. I was uncomfortable with the visibility, but Major Turner encouraged it, said my voice mattered precisely because I wasn't presenting myself as perfectly healed, just as someone actively working toward better functioning. We filmed a short video where I talked about my deployments, my PTSD diagnosis, my ongoing treatment. The message was simple: seeking help demonstrates strength and self-awareness, not weakness. The video was distributed to Air Force bases worldwide as part of mandatory training on mental health resources. Maya saw the video when it was posted online. She watched it twice, her expression serious and focused. Afterwards, she asked if I was famous now. I told her no, just trying to help other people who'd experienced similar things. She asked if talking about hard stuff made it better. I said sometimes that naming difficulty was often the first step toward managing it, that keeping everything internal usually made problems worse. She nodded like this made sense and went back to her homework. That summer, I took 2 weeks of leave and drove Maya to Oregon to visit my parents. They lived on 5 acres outside Eugene, my father retired from teaching and my mother still working part-time as a librarian. Maya loved the space and freedom, running through the property and helping my father tend his vegetable garden. My parents had supported my military career but never fully understood it, had worried constantly during my deployments, had been relieved when I'd transitioned to reserve status. They didn't ask many questions about the custody hearing or the testimony or the public visibility. They just focused on Maya, on enjoying time with their granddaughter. One evening after Maya was asleep, my mother and I sat on the back porch drinking wine. She'd been quiet all day, something clearly on her mind. Finally, she said, "I'm proud of you, Mary. I don't say it enough. What you've done, what you've survived, how you've raised Maya despite everything. I'm proud." "Thank you," I said, surprised by the emotion in her voice. "When you joined the Air Force, I was terrified. I didn't understand why you'd choose something so dangerous, so difficult. I wanted you to have an easier life than that. But I see now that you needed that challenge, that service gave you something essential. And watching how you've handled everything since, the injury and the divorce and all of it, I realize you're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." We sat in comfortable silence after that, listening to crickets and the distant sound of wind through trees. My mother's approval had always mattered even when I'd pretended it didn't. Hearing her acknowledge my choices, my strength, my competence as both an officer and a mother, filled something I hadn't realized was hollow. Maya and I returned to Arizona in August, just before she started 4th grade. She'd grown during the trip, seemed older and more thoughtful. On the drive home, she asked about my deployments, about what Afghanistan had been like. I gave her age-appropriate details, talked about the landscape and the people and the mission without dwelling on danger or violence. She asked if I'd been scared. I said yes, sometimes, but scared wasn't the same as incapable. That courage meant acting despite fear rather than never experiencing it. "Were you scared at the custody court thing?" she asked suddenly. "When Daddy was trying to take me away." I hadn't realized she knew about that. Yes, I was scared. Very scared. That was one of the hardest days of my life. But you won. Not exactly won. The judge just recognized that your daddy's claims weren't fair or accurate. Sometimes the truth speaks for itself if you give it space. She thought about this. "I'm glad you're my mom," she said finally. "Even if you have to work hard and be gone sometimes. You're still the best mom." I had to focus on the road to keep my composure. "Thank you, baby. That means everything to me." Fall brought new responsibilities. I was promoted to Deputy Commander of Training Operations for the 934th, a significant administrative role that meant less direct flying and more program oversight. The position required balancing multiple priorities: curriculum development, personnel management, resource allocation, liaison work with active duty commands. Major Turner had recommended me for the role, saying I had the operational experience and the communication skills to handle the complexity. I accepted despite reservations about moving further from cockpit work. The learning curve was steep. Administrative work required different skills than flying, more patience with bureaucracy, more tolerance for political maneuvering. I attended meetings about budget allocations and training schedules and facility maintenance. I reviewed personnel evaluations and made recommendations about promotions and assignments. I mediated disputes between instructors and students. None of it was glamorous, but all of it mattered, affected how well we prepared young pilots for operational assignments. My veterans group celebrated its 3rd anniversary in November. We'd grown from 6 people to nearly 20, with rotating attendance as some members moved away or transitioned out of active participation. Dr. Vasquez organized a small event, just coffee and conversation, reflecting on how far we'd all come. Carlos spoke about being 3 years sober and rebuilding his relationship with his daughter. Jennifer had graduated with her nursing degree and was working in a VA hospital. David had remarried, cautiously optimistic about his second attempt at partnership. Everyone had struggled, everyone had experienced setbacks, but everyone was still working toward better functioning. That persistence felt like victory even without perfect outcomes. I shared my own update, the promotion, the congressional testimony, the continued balance between military service and parenting. I talked about feeling like I'd finally integrated the different parts of my identity, that I no longer felt torn between being an officer and being a mother, that those roles informed each other rather than competing. Several people nodded in recognition. Dr. Vasquez said that integration was the goal, that healthy recovery meant incorporating difficulty into a coherent life narrative rather than trying to separate or eliminate it. Winter passed quietly. Maya continued thriving in school, her math skills improving to the point where she no longer dreaded homework. I settled into my administrative role, finding satisfaction in systemic improvement rather than individual missions. Ethan and I maintained our co-parenting arrangement with minimal conflict. He'd suggested adjusting the custody schedule to accommodate his growing family, and I'd agreed to reasonable modifications. Our communication remained functional and distant, two people coordinating logistics around a shared responsibility. I dated briefly, a fellow officer I'd met through work. It was pleasant but ultimately didn't develop into anything serious. The relationship reminded me that I was capable of connection, that my capacity for partnership hadn't been destroyed by trauma or divorce, but it also clarified that I wasn't desperate for that connection. I was content with my life as configured, with Maya and my career and my community. If something more developed naturally, I'd consider it, but I wasn't pursuing it actively. Maya asked once if I was lonely, if I wanted a boyfriend like Daddy had a wife. I told her I had good friends and meaningful work and her, that loneliness wasn't about being single, but about lacking connection, that I felt deeply connected to my life. She accepted this with the same matter-of-fact pragmatism she applied to most things. Her generation seemed less troubled by non-traditional family structures, more comfortable with the idea that there were multiple valid ways to build a life. Spring brought unexpected recognition. The Air Force selected me for the Lance P. Sijan Leadership Award, given annually to officers who demonstrate exceptional leadership and dedication to duty. The award was significant, prestigious within military circles. Colonel Reeves called personally to congratulate me, saying the recognition was well-earned and long overdue. The ceremony would be held at the Pentagon in May, with my parents and Maya invited to attend. I flew to Washington, D.C. with Maya, who was thrilled by the adventure and the chance to see the nation's capital. My parents met us there, all of us staying in a hotel near Arlington. The ceremony was formal and dignified, held in a conference room with flag officers and senior enlisted personnel in attendance. Maya sat between my parents, watching everything with wide eyes. When my name was called, I walked forward in my service dress, accepted the award from a 2-star general, and gave brief remarks thanking my crew members, my commanders, and my family for their support. Afterward, during the reception, Maya approached carrying a plate of cookies. "Mama, that general said you saved a lot of lives. Is that true?" "I was part of crews that saved lives," I corrected gently. "It's never just one person, it's always a team. But you were the pilot. You were in charge. Being in charge doesn't mean doing everything yourself. It means making sure everyone can do their part effectively." She considered this while eating a cookie. "When I'm a pilot, will I be in charge too?" "If you want to be, and if you train hard and prove you're capable, then yes. You could be. That's where I'll leave it." I kept my daughter, kept my dignity, and kept flying. If this resonated, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a win today. Questions for you. Have you ever had your competence twisted against you, at work, in court, or at home? What did you do? If you're a veteran or first responder, how do you balance service, recovery, and parenting? What's one boundary you set that changed the outcome for you or your kids? If you were in that courtroom, what would you have said to Ethan? Drop your story below. Someone reading it might need your courage.